Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Linda Sunnan, Manager of Public Programs at Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. On behalf of our CEO, Susan Abrams, our Board of Directors, staff, and volunteers, I am thrilled to welcome you to today's Lunch and Learn. This program, History Will Never Forget the Final Months of World War II, is part of the museum's Liberation 2020 series, Voices of the Liberator, the Liberated, and the Lost, a series dedicated to reflecting on the legacy of the Holocaust and World War II. I would like to thank all of our Liberation 2020 partners listed on our opening slides for their continued support. In just a moment, our distinguished speaker, Dr. Kristen Burton, will begin today's talk. At the end of her presentation, she will take questions through the Q&A box. Now, it is my honor to introduce today's guest speaker, Dr. Kristen D. Burton. Dr. Burton is the Teacher Programs and Curriculum Specialist at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, Louisiana. She received her PhD in Transatlantic History from the University of Texas at Arlington in 2015, and has taught history courses at universities in Texas and Louisiana, as well as online. Dr. Burton currently authors curricular resources featuring the museum's extensive collection from the era of World War II. She also works with teachers across the United States through professional development workshops designed to support them in expanding their knowledge and pedagogical approaches to the history of World War II. And as a little aside, Dr. Burton was with us in January before it was time to close our doors to the museum for a while, offering fabulous professional development for teachers in our area. So Dr. Burton, it's thrilling to have you with us today. We're happy to have you back, and the stage is yours.
Well, thank you, Linda, very much. And thank you to everybody for joining today, for tuning in. It is my pleasure to be with you all online, coming to you from New Orleans, but at the same time, through the power of technology, it's nice to be able to reach these wider audiences. So it is something of a silver lining with these kind of forced virtual programming, but I'm happy to be back with the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and I had an absolute blast traveling up there at the end of January. A bit cold for my taste, but nonetheless, it was an excellent trip. Had a wonderful time working with the museum staff, got to interact with a number of wonderful teachers in the Chicago area. But today, we're going to be talking about the end of World War II, specifically the final months of World War II. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all for a little presentation I put together. And hopefully, everything works a-okay. Now, when we talk about something like liberation, it's often a narrative that's presented in a triumphal way. We talk about liberation in terms of liberating of the concentration camps, death camps run by Nazi forces. And oftentimes when we discuss the history of World War II, there is an overemphasis on the war in Europe, and oftentimes with the point of D-Day and the landing at Normandy of Allied forces on June 6, 1944, from that point until the fall of the Nazi Empire, the Third Reich, there's this thread of victory that runs through. It's almost a given with our comfort of hindsight looking back. We tend to phrase these narratives in this triumphal way, from the point of D-Day to the fall of Nazi Germany in May of 1945. There are caveats to this, of course. The Battle of the Bulge is a major one, and yet, in spite of the hardship and the losses that came with what was an incredibly costly battle, there is still that notion that victory was just on the other side of that moment of hardship. And this tends to frame a lot of the narratives around the end of the war, specifically in the war in Europe. When we talk about, say, liberation of the camps, it is this moment of celebration, right? And here in this opening image, you see American forces marching down the Champs-Élysées in Paris. This is the liberation of Paris, and then coming with it in the following months, the full liberation of France as Allied forces pushed out the Nazis one town, village, and city at a time. And there's nothing to discredit about this moment of liberation. It was exalting for people. The war was coming to an end, a war that was absolutely brutal, absolutely brutal. It left towns and cities destroyed. Millions of lives were lost. For individuals who were suffering under Nazi occupation, to see Allied forces arrive was a true godsend. And I love this quote that comes to us from the Ian Burma book, Year Zero. And he described that moment when people were freed from Nazi occupation, the war was coming to an end. This is specifically in reference to VE Day in England. It says, quote, "There was fantastic Mafeking scenes in the heart of the city as cheering, dancing, laughing, uncontrollable crowds mobbed buses, jumped on the roofs of cars, kissed policemen, and dragged them into the dancing as well." And these tend to be the scenes that come to encompass the end of the war. Ticker tape parades in Times Square, people holding up newspapers, crowded together, hugging, dancing, celebrating. It was a moment of jubilation. But that is also a moment. And when we talk about the story of liberation, we have to look past those moments, because liberation also came wrapped up in years of tragedy and loss. And there are scars that people would carry with them for the rest of their lives. So even though we have this moment of liberation, this moment of celebration, the end of the war was still a painful moment, because so many people didn't get to see that moment of liberation. And for those who did, it didn't always carry the same meaning. So while we are familiar with images such as this, people celebrating the end of the war, happy to see it come to a final, long-awaited end, there are also scenes like this. We see to the left, Nuremberg, and then to the right, in the upper corner, Dresden. And of course, cemetery after cemetery full of those who fell, fighting to free the world from Nazi control, from fascist dictatorship. But this is what was left behind. So you have your moment of celebration, but then reality sinks in. And people looked around them and they found their homes were destroyed, their cities were destroyed. Many of them didn't have homes to return to. So what do we do after this moment of celebration passes? And that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And there's a reason why Ian Burma refers to, and many historians refer to 1945 as Year Zero. In many ways, it was a reset of the world as everyone knew it. Because from that point forward, everything changed. Nothing was the same, and no one could ever pretend like they could go back. And it was those final months that we're going to talk about today that came to really define and set the course for the legacy of World War II and the post-war world that would come to follow. But when we do talk about liberation, as I mentioned before, we often think about liberation of the camps, of concentration and death camps. And this is something that, as I said before, it is often presented as a moment of celebration, and in many ways it was. Ava Schloss, who is a Holocaust survivor who was liberated from Auschwitz-Birkenau, she said about this moment, quote, "You know, with liberation, you imagine a happy day. And oftentimes we think about it this way, but the image on the left there seems to encompass this, the welcoming of Allied forces' final moments of suffering come to an end and freedom on the horizon. But it was also a moment of great uncertainty. And the layers that factor into this idea of liberation are important to peel back to understand the full and encompassing power of that moment, the power and pain that comes to inform these moments. Now, for those familiar with the history, the first camps were liberated by Soviet forces coming in from the east. The Soviet forces began liberating camps 9 full months before American forces began to do the same. And word began to get out. Now, people had known about these camps in varying capacities. American newspapers printed about them throughout the early 40s. There were moments of public recognition and calls for action. People had an idea of what was going on, but the scale of what was happening truly shocked people. And when word began to come out, there's a quote from Colonel Lewis Weinstein, who was in the US Army, and he said about this, "We had heard all kinds of rumors and stories, but they were so horrible that they were indescribable. We just couldn't believe them." And that is a factor in this moment of liberation, because not only are people becoming free and being freed from these camps, there is a realization of what was happening. There's a moment of worldwide shock that follows and will ripple out throughout the years that come. But that moment of liberation was a complicated one for people who survived the camps. I have a few quotes here from a few Holocaust survivors. Joseph Gorbin, who had been rounded up and deported when German Nazi forces moved in and occupied Romania. He said about this, quote, "The devastation caused by the war and the fact that I was an orphan came to me very forcefully on Victory Day. I saw the destruction that the war had wrought much more realistically, I suppose, than I had before. The destruction had been all around me day and night, but only on Victory Day did I notice it on the street where I was walking. It was then, as a boy, that I grasped the full scale of the destruction, and really, Victory Day is engraved in my memory to this day as a day of, not as a day of celebration, not as a day of celebration. It's a day of great pain." And this was true also for the forces who came to liberate the camps. I want to play for you a segment of a oral history clip that comes from the National WWII Museum's oral history collection. This is also part of our classroom resources we supply to teachers to help them tell this story of liberation as well. So to make it out of this, let me stop the share here. My cursor has disappeared on me. There we go. So I'll stop that share, and then I'm going to share this oral history clip. Now this is a clip of a US Army veteran, Harold Berkman, who was a part of the liberating forces to enter Buchenwald. And he was among the first to enter the camp. And you can see, and I want you to look at, as he recounts this memory, look at his eyes. And you can see there is a moment when he is speaking, when he is back in that space. And I think that is a good reminder of those scars that did last an entire lifetime, those scars that people continue to carry with them.
So at any rate, once again, we're moving. We're moving toward Erfurt, and now on the 12th and 13th of April, we're approaching Weimar. And outside of Weimar, we hit the concentration camp, Buchenwald. And this is the first time that Americans had ever seen a concentration camp. We were one of the first GIs. I was one of the first GIs in Buchenwald. When I walked into Buchenwald, and my company walked into Buchenwald, the ovens were still warm. The inmates were 70 pounds, 75 pounds, undernourished. I saw bones where the furnaces were stacked high, and that's another thing you never forget. Now, Patton saw this, and Patton notified Eisenhower immediately because they had never seen a concentration camp before. And Patton and Eisenhower walked through the concentration camp. Now, the statistics.
I'll go ahead and stop that there. But you can see in that moment when his eyes are moving, he's in that space. And I believe it's important when we talk about moments of liberation to remember that that moment will also, the most haunting of moments, also stay with people. As much as Ava Schloss said, you want to think of it as a happy day. But then there is this other side to the story as well. Go back to my slideshow. I think this is another powerful quote from a survivor. Oops, oh my goodness. The quote says, there was joy. Yes, we were free. The gates were open, but liberation had come too late in a lot of ways for individuals who had survived. And then not just for the dead, but for the living as well. And this was one of the reasons why when Eisenhower, Harold Berkman referenced Eisenhower, he said Eisenhower made a point to walk through the camps. This was he famously, Patton couldn't quite do the task. He had to leave at a certain point. But Eisenhower made a point of walking through the camps, of having this documented. Oh my goodness gracious. I don't know what is happening, I apologize. So Patton made a point, we'll just do that for a moment, to walk through the camps. Because he said he wanted to see this documented. He wanted to ensure that there would be no chance that this could ever be chalked up as propaganda, right? So there's a lot of meaning to this moment of liberation, not only for those who survived, but also for the liberators as well. So what happened next? Millions were free from these camps, but where are they supposed to go? Many of them had no home to return to, as I said before. Many of their homes were just destroyed. Even if their homes hadn't been destroyed, what would they be returning to? Homes that were missing family members. Homes that may be located next door to a neighbor who betrayed you. There are many factors that play into this moment of liberation. And in many cases, after these gates are open and people are free to go, they have nowhere to go. Ava Schloss in her oral history went on to say as well that moment the Soviets arrived, they didn't know who they were. The Nazis had rounded up as many prisoners as they could and took them on death marches. But the individuals who stayed behind, they didn't know if the Nazis were coming back. Were they just outside of the gate? What would the Soviet forces do to concentration camp prisoners? There were so many questions, and in the aftermath, many had nowhere to go. So after the end of the war in Europe, the statistic is roughly 11 million people across Europe were considered displaced persons, or DPs. 7 million alone lived in Germany. So Allied forces were responsible for setting up DP camps, displaced persons camps. And in some instances, they repurposed former concentration camps. So we have cases of individuals who were liberated from a concentration camp, who survived the Holocaust, only to go back to a concentration camp because they had nowhere else to go. So this moment of liberation carries as much pain as it does celebration. And this is an important part of the narrative we should take into consideration as well. Now, this is when we want this slide to come up. Regarding the end of the war in Europe, liberation did follow the Allied forces' progress across Europe as they steadily closed in on Berlin. But in the final months of the war, the United States experienced an abrupt change in leadership. On April 12, 1945, a long-time, heading into his third term, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt unexpectedly died, leading to a transfer of power to his vice president, Harry S. Truman, who had only been vice president for 82 days. Truman, who was relatively unknown and had very little executive experience, came in to replace a man who had been so highly regarded, so beloved. The American people had come to know and trust FDR from the Great Depression through the majority of the war. And now we have a transfer of power to this man from Missouri that very few people knew. And this was a moment that Truman summed up himself as, quote, "I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." But Truman was sworn into office at 7:09 p.m. on April 12th, and he stepped in to lead the nation through these final tumultuous months of the war. Now, Adolf Hitler, heard the news of FDR's death, and it gave him a bit of a boost. He saw this as an opportunity to potentially turn the tide of the war, but that hope was long lost by that point. It was only a couple weeks later that Hitler himself would give it up, ultimately committing suicide on April 30th, 2 days after his fascist counterpart Benito Mussolini was executed by a firing squad. So within the course of 3 weeks, in the month of April, a new president came to power, and fascist regimes subsequently fell. So with the fall of these Axis leaders, Berlin was surrounded. Nazi Germany soon surrendered as well, with the signing of formal surrender documents on May 7th, and thus began the moment of occupation. Now, like the moment of liberation, we think of VE, we think of moment of celebration. After that moment of celebration passed, people were faced with a stark reality. What happens now? Military forces that were trained to fight an enemy now had to govern, in a sense. And I will again play a oral history clip for you from the museum's collection. And this is John J.J. Whitmire, who was a longtime volunteer at the World War II Museum before he passed away. And here he recounts his experience serving as a part of the occupying force in Germany after the surrender of Nazi rule.
And then to send me back again, that would be my third tour. And this was early January, I guess, and 1945. And my unit continued in combat role. Things became easier. Once we were across the Rhine, wars became easier. And on about the 19th of April, my unit was halted because all the units were coming together like the mouth of a funnel, you know, headed towards Berlin, you might say. So the war ended there, and I became, again, without training, performing. And when I say without training, that's the same problem they have in Iraq. People get there around civilians, and they have to handle civilians. Before you were killing people, not civilian, but you were not exposed to civilians. Suddenly you got to feed them, you have to keep some discipline, you have to have laws, and that's what the military governor does. And so that's what I had for an assignment in Dortmund, Germany, and I had a jail and a court, and I held court and locked people up overnight and up for curfew and turned them loose. And if somebody was perhaps a werewolf, and this was another story actually. This was the insurgents group, the group that were going to continue the war after the war was lost. And sometime I'll tell you a story about that. But anyway, we arrested one of these fellas, and we did whatever we had to do that the military. We were the police. We were the occupation troops. We were the guard duty. We were the garrison. We were the ones that the people came to with complaints until the British took over that sector.
All right, so J.J. Whitmire, beloved volunteer from the World War II Museum. So I think he raises an important point, and I'll go back to a slideshow. So JJ raises an important point about the place that troops were put in that they were not trained to be an occupying force necessarily, and yet that was the position they found themselves in. They also found themselves in the position of serving as military police, acting as a military government over places that were wholly destroyed. There's a great description from Richard E. Berlin, who was CEO of the Hearst Foundation and received an invitation from Henry Stimson, who was the US Secretary of War. Richard E. Berlin received this invitation to travel to Germany, to post-war Germany. He was one of the first American civilians to travel to the region. And he documented what the state of Germany's capital city was in. And this is the kind of challenges faced by individuals like JJ and other men like him. When he was describing the city of Berlin, he said, quote, "On all sides, we saw overturned tanks and cars. In an area of about 10 miles wide in the center of the city, every building is smashed and destroyed. Berlin ordinarily has a population of 4 million people. Now it is estimated there are 3,500,000 in population, living in cellars, hovels, and anywhere for shelter. Continually, you see food lines, hundreds of people standing in queue for food." And then he went on to describe Berlin as truly a dead city. And that quote, "Words cannot describe the horrid and pitiful existence of its people." And the men trained to fight Nazi forces were now responsible for maintaining order amongst civilians who had learned to despise them, who saw them as an enemy in many regard, and order was difficult to manage, to be sure. So this is the nature of the war in Europe. And again, we have this thread and narrative of liberation, but it's much more complicated than that. And this tension that would come to define the moment of occupation, of course, heightened with increased tension between the occupying forces, especially between the United States and the Soviet Union. But there's also tension between the occupied and the occupier. And this will carry on for years. It takes years to work, to clear, to rebuild. Of course, the great venture of the Marshall Plan helps feed into that, but that also in a lot of ways does feed into these narratives of the victory that is to come. But it's a hard road. So that moment of celebration behind liberation, it's a bit short-lived. So it's important for us to keep in mind these other elements of the liberation story. Now, while the war in Europe may have been over, the war was certainly not over in and of itself. And while Allied leaders gathered to negotiate the post-war peace in Europe, the United States especially was still contending with an ongoing conflict in the Pacific. Now, the Pacific theater of the war only continued, it seemed, to ramp up in intensity and in devastation as the war was going on. The longer it lasted, the more devastating and it became, and the losses became that much greater. And again, Truman is new to executive power, following a commander-in-chief who I think I said he had served he was in his third term. He had served 3 full terms and then dying shortly into his 4th, FDR. Truman comes into this, with very little executive experience and is something of an unknown amongst the other Allied leaders. FDR had a long-standing and close and developing friendship with Winston Churchill. Truman and Churchill had no basis upon which to work. Of course, Churchill would be soon voted out of office and replaced with Clement Attlee in the midst of the Potsdam Conference, which I will get to momentarily. Now, before Truman comes into office, the Battle of Iwo Jima lasted from February 19th to March 26th, 1945, only to be followed by one of the bloodiest and most costliest battles of the war, the Battle of Okinawa. So while this battle was raging, while Okinawa was raging, this is when Truman comes into power. And while the war in Europe is winding down, the war in the Pacific is only continuing to ramp up. And Okinawa would prove to be a chilling lesson for Truman as he comes into power as the new commander-in-chief. Okinawa itself would last nearly 3 months. By the end of the battle, more than 12,000 American servicemen, 93,000 Japanese soldiers, and roughly 140,000 indigenous Okinawan civilians would be dead. Okinawa was also the last major land battle in the Pacific before the prospect of a potential invasion of the Japanese home island. Now, Okinawa itself was only 70 miles long and 7 miles wide. And yet an invasion, an effort to capture Okinawa resulted in catastrophic results. And it proved an important lesson to Truman. And he found himself asking, if this is what happens at Okinawa, what would potentially happen if we were to invade Japan itself? And he summed it up succinctly by saying, the US attempted to invade the Japanese home island, it would be, quote, an Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. The prospect of devastation and death was only increasing the longer the war in the Pacific carried on. Throughout the spring of 1945, the US was also engaging in strategic firebombing campaigns across the Japanese home island using B-29 Superfortress bomber planes. Through these attacks, the US launched a series of devastating firebombing campaigns. In one attack on Tokyo alone, carried out in the evening and early morning hours of March 9th to 10th, 1945, US bombers destroyed 16 square miles of the city and killed an estimated 100,000 civilians and left roughly 1 million more homeless. In spite of this, and in spite of the astronomical casualty rates coming out of these battles, Japan's leaders still refused to surrender. So on July 17th, Through August 7th, 1945, the Allied leaders met together in a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam to discuss the end of the war in Europe, how they would structure it, how they would approach it, how they would divide power. But Truman was also there to secure Allied support in helping to end the war in the Pacific. But he had something in his mind that he knew about, that the other Allied leaders didn't fully understand, although one of them had a pretty good idea of what was going on. The day before the Potsdam Conference began, Truman received word of a successful test that was carried out in the New Mexican desert, and that was the Trinity test. And this occurred on July 16th, 1945. The Manhattan Project, which I don't have time to get into, but we can certainly discuss in more detail in the Q&A if you all would like. Manhattan Project was a years-long secret program. It was one of the best kept secrets. Again, spies did infiltrate, and individuals like Stalin did receive word of what was happening, but Stalin himself said he never truly understood until atomic bombs were actually put to use in combat, the exact power that they were dealing with here. But the Trinity test proved that the atomic weaponry developed through the Manhattan Project could be successful. The Trinity test itself was a test of a plutonium bomb, nicknamed Gadget. And when detonated, it let loose a massive fireball of intense heat and resulted in a mushroom cloud pictured here that stretched over 40,000 feet across and rose over 35,000 feet in the air. General Leslie Groves, who was responsible for overseeing the Manhattan Project, wrote a report about the Trinity test. And in this report, he said, quote, "The test was successful beyond the most optimistic expectations of anyone. Based on the data which has been possible to work up to date, I estimate the energy generated to be in excess of the equivalent of 15,000 to 20,000 tons of TNT. This is a conservative estimate." Now, Truman learned of the Manhattan Project shortly after coming into office, and he received word of the successful Trinity test right before the start of the Potsdam Conference. So he took this knowledge with him into the conference proceedings, and it fed into the ultimate declaration that resulted, the Potsdam Declaration, which laid out the conditions for Japan's unconditional surrender. The Potsdam Declaration stated, quote, "The time has come for Japan to decide whether she will continue to be controlled by those self-willed militaristic advisors whose unintelligent calculations have brought the Empire of Japan to the threshold of annihilation, or whether she will follow the path of reason." This moment was Japan's last opportunity to surrender. And in response, Prime Minister of Japan, Prime Minister Suzuki, responded to the declaration stating, quote, "The government of Japan does not consider it having any crucial value. The only alternative for us is to be determined to continue our fight to the end," end quote. This final refusal solidified Truman's decision to use the atomic bombs against Japan. So in the early morning hours of August 6, 1945, recently commemorated the 75th anniversary of this date, the American bomber Enola Gay took off from the island of Tinian, set its course for Japan, and its target, the city of Hiroshima. What's interesting about this moment, this day, is that morning in Hiroshima, multiple air raid sirens sounded, warning individuals of the city of a potential attack, but then the air raid sirens were followed by an all clear signal. So people didn't really know what was going on. But by the time the final siren sounded, the Enola Gay had already dropped a 9,700-pound uranium-based bomb called Little Boy. And it detonated at 8:15 a.m., destroying everything, almost everything within a 1-mile radius, killing 80,000 people and injuring 35,000 more, and thousands more would die in the days, weeks, and months that followed from radiation poisoning caused by the blast. Japan did not respond to this moment with a willingness to surrender. If anything, they attempted to call the United States bluff, thinking that this was the only bomb the US had. 3 days later, on August 9th, the US did drop an additional atomic bomb. This was a plutonium-based bomb that was 10,300 pounds in weight, called Fat Man. The initial target was the Japanese city of Kokura, but when the B-29 boxcar arrived at Kokura, the cloud coverage was too dense. They couldn't properly see where they needed to drop the bomb, so they instead rerouted to their backup target, Nagasaki. Fat Man detonated at 11:02 a.m. and destroyed 1/3 of the city, killing 40,000 and injuring 60,000 more. This would bring the war in the Pacific to a rapid end, where the war in Europe was a war fought with a steady tightening of forces and battles over cities until Berlin itself fell. The dropping of 2 atomic bombs brought the war in the Pacific to a devastating and swift end. On August 10th, the Japanese government communicated to the Allies that they would accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration, and unconditional surrender was imminent. On August 15th, the Emperor of Japan, Hirohito, issued a broadcast. It's known as the Jewel Voice broadcast. He recorded it the night before, and it aired on the 15th, and it announced the end of the war. And it was a significant moment for the Japanese people because many of them had not heard his voice before that point. But the language of this broadcast was intentionally obscure. They used phrases like, "The wartime situation has developed, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. We must endure the unendurable and suffer the insufferable." But at no point did he ever use the word surrender. So the Japanese people didn't even really know what was going on. But nonetheless, Japan did concede defeat. And on September 2nd, 1945, Allied and Japanese officials gathered on the USS Missouri to formalize Japan's surrender and initiate the beginning of America's occupation. Now, we can get into it more in the Q&A because I do want to allow time for that. But the two ends of the wars in Europe and in the Pacific had drastic consequences. Again, this idea of 1945 as year zero. We see America emerge as a superpower. It had not been before. And also an unexpected superpower similarly emerged on the scene in the Soviet Union. And the two, in the years to come, would fight continually over greater world dominance with the Cold War. World War II would leave a legacy of new ideas about human rights and notions of justice. The Nuremberg trials, in which Allied forces would hold individuals accountable for war crimes, Axis leaders, both political and military. Notions of genocide came out of World War II. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish lawyer, coined the term genocide in order to describe the sheer scale of atrocity that was the Holocaust. This idea of crimes against humanity came out because of World War II. We also have the creation of the United Nations, and following that, a universal declaration of human rights. People's thinking of governance and the idea of rights and equality and justice fundamentally changed because of World War II. And there are movements for equality that came from this as well. Black servicemen who returned home suddenly, not suddenly, but even more so began to call out the segregation. They fought against fascism abroad and yet are second-class citizens when they return home. And we see movements like the Double V campaign emerge through World War II and civil rights movements that subsequently followed. Women gaining additional experience in the workplace, abilities to leave the home, also increasingly began to call for more opportunities in the public sphere. There were also movements for decolonization that followed World War II. This may be one of the greatest unintended consequences of World War II, that Asia, which Japan claimed it would liberate from Western conquest and imperialism, Japan wanted to free Asia of Western influence and instead became an imperial power unto itself, one that wreaked havoc and devastation on the people they conquered. With their fall, you have a vacuum of power, and in places like China and French Indochina becomes Vietnam. We have India looking to oust British rule. The Philippines gained their independence from the United States in 1946. These massive changes that came as a result of this war. This is all part of this narrative of liberation, and something we must take into account as well. And with a closing, I just want to leave you with one quote from Eleanor Roosevelt, delivered in a 1951 broadcast. She said, "It isn't enough to talk about peace. One must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it. One must work at it." Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Burton. That was a tremendous overview and really powerful explanation of what happened and the repercussions and the significance of after the war. We do have a few questions, so I want to get to them real quickly. The first one is, if you'd please discuss why the second bomb after Hiroshima. Why was it dropped?
Why did it happen?
Yeah.
So that decision was made that Truman came to the conclusion they had 2 atomic bombs already developed, ready to go. And he said, we're going to drop these 2 bombs. Now, Richard Frank, who the World War II Museum is lucky to work with frequently, has pointed out that the Japanese government almost didn't believe the United States that they had more of these weapons because they were so powerful. And they essentially wanted to see the US put as many of them to use as they could, to see, like, to prove they had this arsenal of sorts. And it was with the dropping of a second bomb that the Japanese government came to believe, well, the US may actually have this arsenal. Now, those were the only 2 bombs the United States had at that time, but the United States was prepared to make more. As whatever it took to end the war in the Pacific, Truman had made up his mind. That final refusal to accept the surrender with the Potsdam Declaration was Japan's last opportunity. And Truman decided he would have done everything he could to bring that war to an end. Now, to be clear, it's historical research has shown FDR would have been clear about it too. FDR would have likely used those bombs. He green-lighted the entire Manhattan Project, and he had intentions of, if the war in Germany carried on any longer than it did, they would have used those weapons against Germany as well. That didn't ultimately happen, but historical research shows that that was a strong possibility.
Thank you. And there is a follow-up question to what you just spoke about. Do you think Truman understood not just the immediate deaths that would result from the atomic bombs, but the generations of health impact and problems that would result from his decision?
Ultimately, no. No one understood. They didn't fully understand the effects of radiation, and in many ways, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were widespread, it sounds crass to say, but widespread experiments. The military, and Leslie Groves was part of this as well, intentionally selected Japanese cities that had been largely spared from the previous firebombing campaigns because they wanted to measure the full extent and destruction of these bombs. I mean, to keep in mind, they had only detonated 1 atomic bomb before putting the others to use. And there was no real understanding of what could happen. There was only educated guesses. But after bombings occurred there were months of scientists coming into these areas and documenting what happened, examining the people affected by the radiation. And in many ways, that was how they came to learn, through this direct use. Truman himself did not understand. It was always his hope and goal that as few civilians would be killed as possible. He wanted to emphasize the targeting of military targets over civilian targets, but nonetheless, he also knew civilians would die. But given the alternative options presented to him by his advisors, it seemed to be the best choice in his mind. And he never apologized and never expressed any regret for the decision that he made, because he felt to the end that he made the correct choice.
Thank you for that. I just want to let our audience know that the questions are coming in fast and furious. We only have a few minutes left, so please understand that we will not be able to get to all of them. But with that said, let's keep going. Why the carpet bombing of Dresden that killed hundreds of citizens when it wasn't a major manufacturing center for the Germans?
So this is more of a military strategy question, which does lay a little beyond my own area of research. There are military historians who can certainly speak to this better than I can. My focus tends to be more on like social and cultural aspects of World War II, but I will give it a shot. It is my understanding that the Allies were interested in breaking Germany in any way possible. Like I said, there is likely an answer to this that is better specified for people who understand and have studied the military strategies more specifically. Unfortunately, I'm not one of those individuals, and I apologize. But it is my understanding that they were just looking to deny Germany as much access to resources as possible. They just break them down as they moved in on Berlin. That's my best guess. It may not be correct.
Nonetheless, the depth and breadth of your knowledge is tremendous, and people are clamoring.
Okay.
So, so thank you for giving that one your best shot.
It's an attempt.
I'm sorry. I'm trying to get a variety in.
Mm-hmm.
So, were refugees from the Soviet Union placed in repurposed camps near Berlin? Do you know?
So, yes. Basically, people who were freed from concentration camps, which did include Soviet prisoners, Soviets were rounded up and captured in more indiscriminate ways than other like American forces or other Allied forces by the Germans. There was a special kind of hatred between the Germans and the Soviets. So you see, and that image, and I'll just pull it up one more time because I don't believe I gave it proper credit. Let me share my screen real quick one more time. There was an image in this slideshow that I want to point out because here, this image, that's a Soviet prisoner of war confronting a Nazi guard after the camp had been liberated. And I know this is not exactly what the person is asking about, but I think it's an incredibly powerful image because you can see the anger come through in this image. So this is a Soviet prisoner of war. And when prisoners of war were released, they were similarly mixed up with other displaced persons. So this DP camps included non-Jewish survivors of concentration camps, survivors of the Holocaust, POWs across the board, including a number of Soviets. There was also former Nazis who were displaced and put into these same camps. And there were instances in which survivors of the Holocaust found themselves right next to and living in the vicinity of former Nazis, or just Nazis at that point, right? So they were complicated places, but that's a long answer to essentially say yes. It was hard to keep track of who was where. and where people should go, the sheer scale of the number of people who've been displaced was just overwhelming. Like I said, 7 million, roughly 7 million displaced persons in Germany alone. And that is a difficult thing to manage in any regard.
So I'm going to read two questions because they really dovetail. One is, when we speak about World War II, does it refer to the Pacific and the Holocaust only to Europe, or why the two names? So I'm reading it exactly, and that kind of goes into why do narratives around liberation appear more in discussions about the war in Europe than in the Pacific?
Well, this is a great question, because when we talk about World War II, broadly, we're talking about all of it, right? We're talking about the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. Oftentimes when it's taught, the war in Europe gets a greater focus and attention than the war in the Pacific. But it is the same conflict in a lot of ways. That being said, they are also, in a lot of ways, two separate wars. And so they're tied together by being a part of the same global conflict, but they're so fundamentally different. The war in Europe was largely a land-based, I mean, after especially the D-Day invasion, the landing in Normandy, the focus is land-based battles and moving in. You saw this, earlier with the invasion. We have North Africa, you have Italy. There's so much focus on invading and trying to take territory, whereas the Pacific is largely naval-based. And when they are fighting to take land in the Pacific, it's these tiny, tiny islands, these little atolls that are just almost don't appear on the map. They're so small. And yet the island hopping campaign was incredibly devastating. The fighting tactics were different in Europe from the Pacific. You have the issue of the Holocaust in Europe, which comes to take so much attention for good cause. That being said, in the Pacific, the Japanese engaged in a number of atrocities as well, but targeted at people they had conquered. And while they had prisoner of war camps and they had other camps, they don't receive the same kind of attention. So the meaning of liberation in historical narratives has tended to focus primarily on the war in Europe because of this steady march to freedom that tends to characterize these narratives. The Pacific doesn't have that. The Pacific doesn't have that because of the increasing devastation, the high death tolls, ultimately culminating in this highly controversial decision to drop atomic bombs on 2 cities. That narrative of a triumphal march to freedom doesn't fit over there. So when we talk about historical narratives, we have to think of them as intentionally constructed narratives because they tell a story. And we try to and we do this to make sense of the past, but the past is messy. And sometimes there is no neat conclusion to these events. And that has, in a way, shaped the way we think about the war in Europe and the war in the Pacific. They are a part of the same global conflict, but in many ways, they are unique and distinct conflicts unto themselves.
Thank you for that. I'm hesitant to put you on the spot, so I'm going to ask you to answer this by way of email to me that I can distribute it to everyone. There are many requests for what are the best books to continue learning.
Absolutely,
so,
I'm happy to supply a few titles. There's a really good one by the author's last name is Lowe. Savage Continent is a good one, just to start, but I'm happy to supply an extended reading list as well that you can distribute via email. But if you want to get a jump start, I would highly recommend Savage Continent.
That's terrific.
The name of the author escapes me, but the last name is Lowe. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. And some people have asked about a recording of this video so they can really chew on it a little bit later. You will get a link to the recording in about a week in your email, in your inbox, and we will include that the bibliography as well. So I just can't thank you enough. This was a fabulous program, and I think we all learned a tremendous amount.
Well, thank you for coming back. Yeah. And I apologize for the technical issues. I don't know why my cursor decided to disappear on me about halfway through that presentation, but I appreciate you all hanging with me throughout that, and also for attending today. And it's just a real joy to reconnect with everyone at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I want to thank everyone for attending. I have just a few brief announcements, so please stay on the call for a second. I want you to know that the museum is now open Wednesday through Sundays, 10 a.m. through 5 p.m., with the last entry at 4 p.m. And we have an exciting development about that. Thanks to the generosity of Rhodey Glass, Wednesdays are now free days through the end of the year. So, but remember, please, no matter which day you're planning on attending, you have to reserve your tickets online before arriving at the museum for everyone's safety. In the chat box, you're going to see two links that I put in there. One is to the survey. Please let us know how we're doing. This is how we can plan the most effective programs for you, and also let our funders know the reaction to the programs that we offer, and go forward with them. Finally, if you're looking for more programs to enjoy, I also put the link to the events page, which lists all our upcoming programs. Take a look at that, because we will look forward to seeing you very soon at another Lunch and Learn or one of the wonderful evening programs that's coming up. Okay, we're right at 1, so I'm going to wish everyone a fabulous afternoon, and thank you again to everybody. Be well.